All right, so in this video lesson, we're going to continue to use those trig ratios that we were talking about in the last two sections, but now we're going to use them in reverse. In other words, we're actually going to be able to use those trig ratios to help us find a missing angle rather than a missing side. Now, in order to do that, we're going to have to use a new type of trig function known as an inverse trig function. So when we're using trig ratios to find the measure of one of the angles in a right triangle, we're going to use the inverse ratio, which is written as sine inverse, cosine inverse, and tangent inverse, which are right here for you. You need to at least know two sides of the triangle in order to find the angle. If you don't know at least two sides, there really is not going to be anything you can do. So let's just make sure we know how to use the calculator first to find each of these values. So we're given our equation for this first example. So for sine of A is equal to 8/15. And notice that to solve for that angle, we're using the inverse sign. Now, to get to that button on your calculator, sine inverse, if you're using the Desmos calculator, same as I am, it's actually going to be under the functions menu. So what looks like the word func, that's going to be the button you'll press, and then notice that you've got the sine inverse button for you right here. Once you've pressed that, you'll just go back to the keyboard, type in your fraction, so 8/15, press enter, and it's going to tell you that the measure of that angle is 32.2 degrees to the nearest tenth. Okay, let's do the same thing with the next example. So cosine of B is equal to 18/22. So we're going to use the inverse cosine in order to solve. So again, go back to functions, hit cosine inverse. We'll type in our fraction, which was 18/22. Press enter, and we'll get 35.1 to the nearest tenth. All right, lastly, for tangent. So we've got tangent of A is equal to 16/20. Again, we're going to use the inverse tangent. So again, we'll press that functions button, find the tangent inverse key, and then we'll type in 16/20. And that will tell us that the measure of our angle is 38.7 degrees to the nearest tenth. All right. So now that we at least know where to find those buttons on the calculator, let's see some of these in action. So let's get ready to set some up on our own and then solve from there. So here's your step-by-step. So step one, you're going to circle the angle or label the angle that you're looking for. Step number two, we're then going to label our sides, kind of like what we would have done anyways in the last two sections. So we'll label it as either the hypotenuse, opposite, or adjacent, depending on which angle you're looking at. Next, we're going to obviously pick sine, cosine, or tangent. The way we're going to do that, just a reminder, is we're going to use SOHCAHTOA. So if you have not already written that somewhere on your notes for today, that would be a good thing to write out. And then step four, we're going to solve our equation using the inverse, so using those buttons that we just found, which were sine, cosine, and tangent inverse. Okay, so for each of these, we're going to find x. Notice that it says we're going to round to the nearest degree, so we're going to actually round to the nearest whole number for each of these problems. Okay, so let's take a look at this first example. We've got our angle x. We've got the side which is opposite of x, which is 15. Then we've also got the side which is opposite the right angle, so 24 has to be the hypotenuse. So setting up our equation, opposite and the hypotenuse, that's going to have to be our first ratio, which is the sine of the angle. So we would say that the sine of our angle x is equal to our opposite side, which is 15, divided by our hypotenuse, which is 24. So then to solve, here's the step that was written out for us before, but notice that really all you're doing is changing from sine to sine inverse, and then you're replacing x with the 15/24. And then if you want to say that that's equal to x, that would be okay. So really x and 15/24 are swapping places. What's letting us do that is to write it as sine inverse. So now we just need to type this into our calculator, get the angle to the nearest degree, and we should be done. So sine inverse, we'll go to our functions menu, sine inverse, type in 15/24, and that is 38.7. So round that up to 39 degrees to the nearest degree. All right, let's do another example. So now we've got our angle X, we've got our side which is adjacent to the angle, we've also got the side which is opposite the right angle, so that's gonna have to be the hypotenuse. All right, so adjacent and hypotenuse, this time that means we're using cosine. So we would say that the cosine of our angle, so cosine of X, is equal to our adjacent side, which is 8, divided by our hypotenuse, which is 11. So then to solve, let's switch cosine to being cosine inverse. So cosine inverse of our fraction 8 over 11 has to be equal to X. And now we just need to type that into a calculator to get that to our nearest degree. So function cosine inverse, 8 over 11 is the fraction. And to the nearest degree, since it's 43.3, we'll round that down to 43 degrees for our answer on this second example. All right, let's take a look at a few more just to make sure this all makes sense, and then you'll have a chance to practice with the homework. Again, I would go ahead and make sure that somewhere on this sheet of paper, or if you're still on the same sheet, then you can just continue to use the one you wrote before, but make sure you got SOHCAHTOA written out somewhere. Okay, so for this next example, we've got our angle, which is X, we've got our side opposite that angle, we've also got the side adjacent to that angle. So opposite and adjacent, that would have to be the tangent of our angle. So we're going to say that the tangent of X degrees is equal to our opposite side, which is 20, divided by our adjacent side, which is 37. Then we'll switch from being tangent of X to being tangent inverse of our fraction, which was 20 over 37. And that's going to be equal to X. So now let's type that into our calculator to get our decimal approximation. So tangent inverse of 20 over 37. And to the nearest degree, 28.4 would round down to being 28 degrees. All right. For our next example, here's our angle X. Compared to that angle, we have our adjacent side, which is 18. We also have the side opposite our right angle, so that is our hypotenuse. All right, so setting up our equation here, we're going to say adjacent and hypotenuse, that's going to have to be cosine. So we're going to say that the cosine of our angle X is equal to our adjacent side, which is 18, divided by our hypotenuse, which is 23. Then we'll go ahead and switch to taking cosine inverse of our fraction. So cosine inverse of 18 over 23, and that's going to equal X. So then typing that in, we'll get our approximation. Go ahead and clear that. So cosine inverse of 18 over 23, which is 38.5. So we'll go ahead and round that up to being 39 degrees. If you wanted to say 38 degrees, that would be okay too. All right. For this next example, we've got our angle X, we've got our side which is opposite that angle, which is 40, and the hypotenuse, which is opposite the right angle, which is 41. So opposite and hypotenuse, that's going to tell us to use the sine. So we're going to say that the sine of our angle X has to equal our opposite side, which is 40, divided by our adjacent, which is 40, or our hypotenuse, which is 41. So then we'll switch from sine to sine inverse of our fraction, which is 40 over 41, and that's going to be equal to X. So now we just need to type that into our calculator to get our answer to the nearest degree. So sine inverse, let me clear that real quick. So sine inverse of 40 over 41, and that's going to be equal to 77.3, so we'll round that down to 77 degrees for this example. All right, one last example to look at. So we've got our angle X, we've got our side which is adjacent to it, we've also got our side which is opposite the angle, So opposite and adjacent, once again, we're going to be using the tangent. So we're going to say that the tangent of x is equal to our opposite side, which is 7, divided by our adjacent side, which is 5. Then we'll switch to tangent inverse of our fraction 7/5 is going to be equal to x. And now, just one last step, once again, typing that into our calculator. Tangent inverse of 7/5 is going to be equal to 54.4, so we'll round that down to being 54 degrees. All right, guys, that is it for this notes video. Until next time, have a great rest of your day.